government from 2006 to 2016 and was Executive Director of the Manila Observatory from 2016 to 2017. He is currently the Director of the Energy Collaboratory of the Manila Observatory and the Chair of the Forest Foundation of the Philippines. Previously, Tony was Undersecretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in the Philippines, a Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, and a co-founder of the Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center. Dr. Tony has been an educator for 38 years, starting his career as a Jesuit, volunteer, and philosopher, teacher, first in 1981 in Xavier University in Cagayan de Oro. He currently teaches law, philosophy, environmental policy, governance, and politics in more than a dozen tertiary learning institutions in the Philippines, including 5 Catholic universities and at the Redemptoris Mater Mission Seminary in Manila. He obtained his master's, LLM, and doctorate in law JST from Yale University and his first degrees from the University of the Philippines in law and the Ateneo de Manila University in philosophy. Dr. Tony has played leadership roles in the global climate change negotiation, having been a lead negotiator for Philippines in the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement negotiations. He has also chaired several global negotiations on climate change, notably on forests and climate change. So in our midst, we really welcome this eminent person and expert on climate change. Let's put our hands together and give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Father Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually the 3rd or 4th time Bishop Alvin also, when he was still doing this, invited me a few times with meetings of the FABC on climate change. I think before Paris, after Paris, and now what's next? Before Madrid, supposed to be before Chile. There's a meeting, was supposed to be a meeting in Chile, but because of the unrest in Chile, it's now being moved to Spain, to Madrid, Spain in a few weeks' time. But the most important meeting on climate change is going to happen next year in 2020 in Glasgow, Scotland. Hopefully it will still be part of the United Kingdom at the time. But the UK is supposed to host, and they're hosting it in Glasgow. And it's 5 years after Paris, so it's like an assessment of where we are. My duty is to present you an updated briefing of the science and the politics of climate change, and a lot of things have happened. Just this year alone, a lot of new science has come out, so I'll try to give you the latest science, especially to the extent that it affects our region. I think it's very important for you to know. Of course, I'll share with you the latest politics as well. Literally, yesterday, the United States officially pulled out from the Paris Agreement. So what does that mean? What does that imply? Of course, I will also end with the question that's asked in this seminar. What does this mean for seminary formation? And then actually begin with that and then end with that as well. Because it's not, the politics is complicated, can require science, political science. Thus, the natural science, the physical science is very complicated. It's hard to follow. You sort of just have to trust the scientists that they're making the right studies and making the right conclusions. It's hard to follow. But actually, in terms of impacts on the church and impacts on seminary formation, it's not rocket science. I mean, I think that climate change and the challenge of the climate emergency, I call it now the emergency because it's no longer 50 years away, 70 years away. It's here, but especially it's actually within the next 20 to 30 years that we get to get to experience the worst. But the science or the impact of the climate emergency, the challenge of the impact of the climate emergency on the church and on human institutions doesn't require rocket science. I think it requires a more prophetic church, with very strong assertions about climate justice, about social justice, about development. It also requires a church that is more compassionate and shows us the way on how to live with empathy and compassion in a very harsh physical world. I mean, I think regardless of how successful we are in the prophetic side of the work that has to be done, which is immediate, it will still be a harsh physical world, and that requires above all, societies that are compassionate, people that have empathy for each other, people that have charity for each other. That's your ultimate adaptation mechanism. There's lots of technologies, and I'll talk about that. There's lots of interventions you can do, social interventions, but the ultimate adaptation measure, your assurance that your world is not going to be what you call a dystopian world, a very bad world for all of us, a very cruel world for us. Your assurance for that is if you have trained people, educated people, to be charitable to each other, more charitable than we are today. And I think the church is probably the best institution in the world to show us the way, on how to be charitable and how to be compassionate. And the reason is obvious. Can I use this? Sorry. Is it the pointer? No? Which is what do I need to move? Okay, are you sure? Okay, thank you. And I want to segue now, reason why we need more compassion, more charity, because it will be a very tough world that we are going to see. Regardless, and this is regardless of how successful we are in mitigating climate change, regardless of how successful we are in the prophetic side, in the next 10 years to move away from a very bad outcome. Even with that, we will still be faced with a harsh physical world. Now I call this next, please. You see that world before you of people and forests and ecosystems, and I call climate change a black issue. It's not a brown issue for climate change. It's not a green issue. It's not a brown issue. It's a black issue because it's an existential issue. It's not about ending the end of the world. I don't think, from a scientific point of view, there's no way you can say that, right? And so I won't venture into that. But it's an existential in the sense that the world that we know after climate change has hit us in the next 30 to 40 to 50 years will be very different from the world that we have today. That's why I call it a black issue. It's dark. We need to understand even now how dark it's going to be and how we're going to respond. Next, please. The last 6 months, or the last year and a half, I would say, because the last one I will mention was released a year and a half ago. So the right time frame is the last one, a year and a half, the last 2 years. We've had 4 major reports that have come out, scientific reports that have come out about climate change that you should know of. Just yesterday, or just last week, a report on cities came out, including cities in Asia, coastal cities. The prognosis is very bad for many of the cities. I was telling Bishop Alvin, it wasn't a joke, nor tried to be lighthearted about it, but Mumbai is like one of the biggest cities that are challenged. But all our coastal cities of our region, Asia, is challenged. The Philippines is not there, but only because the Philippines is not in the mainland. So we haven't studied, the Philippines has to be studied specifically. Every island has to be studied. But in all our mainland, where there are coastal areas and big coastal cities, the new data shows that there's a strong likelihood, it's not certain, but strong likelihood of being submerged, of those cities being submerged. 300 to 400 million people are going to be exposed. And very important, this is because of sea level rise. Very important to understand this. The change also is that's going to happen by 2050, 2040, 2040, 2050, 2060. I started studying climate change. It was my doctoral dissertation in Yale University in 1990. And in 1990, we were already told that this could happen, but there was very uncertain at that time. This could, the scientists would say this might happen, this could happen, but they will always say it will happen at the end of the 21st century. And that's always been our problem, because when we tell policymakers about the problem of climate change, if you are true to the science at the point that you brief them, you do have to say that we're talking about impacts that will happen at the end of the 21st century, so 2100. But now all those estimates have been revised, and the big impacts begin to happen by 2040, by 2050. And think about that in terms, maybe many of us will no longer be alive by then, would be certainly be retired by then. But the seminarians that you're training now will be the bishops and the rectors at the time. They'll be very much alive, and they'll have to deal with this. So they'll have to know this ahead of time to be able to prepare their own seminarians and themselves to the leadership roles and the leadership needs that such a challenge would require. Anyway, one of the reports, I wasn't able to integrate the cities report because this happened literally just this week, and it's all the news reports. I want to be able to absorb first the data there and double check the data. But we did have a couple of months ago, a report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on oceans and cytosphere in a changing climate. It's a special report. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the scientific body of the world on climate change. I mean, don't ever believe people that say that this is not good science. People that criticize the IPCC. I know the IPCC, how it does its work. It's thousands of scientists all over the world that go over thousands of articles that have been written, that have studies that have been done, do peer review of each other, and then actually negotiate in a sense that they have to debate with each other on what the conclusions they can make out of this X number of studies that have been made. So by the time a report is issued, the report is validated, the science is validated, there is peer review already over it, and you can actually say that that maybe the problem with the IPCC is that they are too faithful to the scientific method. They actually do not want to raise alarm. They do not want to exaggerate. They tend to be moderate in terms of language, to be conservative, that's a term, to be conservative in language. That's why, in my view, having read all the IPCC reports since 1990 we're now on the 6th assessment report, or the 5th assessment report, what I've seen is the IPCC is often, the conclusions are often more conservative, and that when it's eventually validated, they tend to be more radical, the conclusions. What happens in the underground is more alarming than what the IPCC had predicted. So here in this report, they say that the ocean has absorbed most of the excess heat and a significant portion of the world's emissions since the 1980s. Meaning to say, it's our oceans that are getting this heat. And so the oceans and all our bodies of water are getting hotter, getting warmer. It's not really something that we see every day, because we don't go to the beach every day, we don't go swim every day. But it has a huge impact on, of course, on the resources that are in the oceans and in the seas. It also has a very serious impact on coastal areas, on sea level rise and those things. I was actually, I just came literally from the pilgrimage in the Holy Land in Israel just before coming here. I arrived Saturday night, I mean, and we spent a lot of time in the area of Galilee and the Jordan River, and so the climate change person in me was always looking at the scientific information. What will happen to the Sea of Galilee? What will happen to Jordan? And what they've measured how hot it has become. Both bodies of water that's so important for what it's called the geography of salvation might not survive as we know it in the next 30 to 40 years. Might actually die out, like the Mekong in our region is dying out. I mean, because precisely of climate change. So this report is important because it tells us that our oceans are in trouble. Next, please. So the global impacts of that, you have that there. You have thermal expansion, glaciers. That's very the reason why the sea level rise projections have changed is because the impact on glaciers, on the Greenland ice sheet, the Antarctic ice sheet, the dynamics of those are going to be have become very serious and is changing our ocean patterns and currents that was not predicted even as far back as 10, 20 years ago. The relationship between land and water is also affected by this change in the oceans. Next. You will expect more marine heat waves, shifts in ecosystems, and as I said already and a few times, sea level rise. Next. We also had, this was also a few months ago, a special report on climate change and land. There's no escape. It's sea, water, whether it's water or land, climate change will follow us. No? And there's no region in the world that will be exempted. Except that the poor countries and poor people will suffer first and suffer most because of their ability to move around is severely restricted, and the resources to adapt is inadequate compared to rich countries and rich people. But land is another one of those, like the ocean. It emits, it's a powerful sink. It absorbs carbon dioxide, but it also emits carbon dioxide. So the management of land is very important to mitigate climate change as well as to adapt to climate change. Of course, human beings, we need land for food. We need land for many of our needs. For biodiversity, we need our protected areas. We need our forests. Next. And that study has found out, again, very important global impacts resulting from climate change. Desertification, which is creating vast deserts, as well as desertifying places, getting places to have without water, for example, happening in places that you didn't expect them to be. I was talking to our brothers from Vietnam. I mean, in the 1990s, I actually worked in Vietnam, Cambodia, Yunnan province in China, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia as well, in the Mekong region, trying to help the governments in the region, especially the local governments, manage the water. And we could already see the challenges coming for the Mekong River, but not the extent to what we are seeing now. No, that sometimes, the Mekong River, for those of you who know it and have seen it, it's like an ocean as well. I mean, in some places, it's a huge body of water, but it's sometimes reduced to very little water that cannot service anymore the multiple goals, objectives that the river was supposed to service in that region. And there are, of course, other geographical, geopolitical reasons for that. I mean, China, for example, is a major user of the Mekong River that has an impact on the rest of the country. Land degradation is another result of climate change, just a sheer change of temperature, and then extreme weather events, something we are familiar with in this region, is degrading has degraded land in ways that makes it impossible for us to be able to feed ourselves in the future unless we find adaptation measures to make agriculture more productive. That the result of that is, of course, food insecurity all over the world. I mean, and so the special report on land also alarms all of us, and is a big warning to the world and to our region, because we depend on land on this region. We depend on agriculture in this region. Next. Now, before I go to the last report, which is the 1.5 report, which was released a year and a half to 2 years ago, I just want to show this graphic about what are we talking about when we're talking about climate change. No? So next, so you have the sun, and this is the earth, and this is the earth's atmosphere. Next. Basically, without the heat from the sun hitting the earth, we are going to all die. We'll have a cold, no life is possible without the heat of the sun. There's life on earth because there's the sun that gives us heat, that gives us light, that gives us warmth. Next. But too much of the sun will make it too hot, right? Will burn us. So some of that heat has to bounce back, and it automatically bounces back. It's like light. When you throw light, it bounces back. When you throw warmth, it bounces back. So it bounces back like that. But at the same time, naturally, some of this heat should stay in the earth, because if it doesn't stay on the earth, we'll also die. We'll have a cold age, an ice age. It will be too cold. Next. So some of it has to stay here, some of it has to go out. That's a natural process. This is, I guess, how God created the world that we have. I mean, and that's a natural process. Next. But what human beings have done is to proceed, please. The sun coming in, going out, but because of us, we have kept more of the sun's warmth to stay with us. That's called the greenhouse effect. So you see this green thing? That wasn't there in that earlier illustration. This is called the greenhouse effect, which is a human effect on the natural process of the sun's warmth going out. Because we pollute the atmosphere through our anthropogenic actions, usually fossil fuel, coal, oil, deforestation. When we cut forests, we release carbon into the atmosphere. Use of agriculture, methane, industrial process, cement factories, for example, emit a lot of those gases. You cover the atmosphere with this green house, therefore keeping more of the warmth here. And that's what's happening. What's happening is the world is becoming warmer because of this human-created greenhouse, and it cannot. The warmth that's coming, that came, cannot go out as before. We have too much heat in our atmosphere. Next, and basically, as of today, from 1750, which is the start of the Industrial Revolution, we have increased the global temperature by 1 degree, just by human action, because there's also natural variations. But the human action, human activities, human anthropogenic activities have heated the world by at least 1 degree. And the debate is, I think Bishop Alvin pointed out, the debate 5 years ago in Paris was whether we should allow up to 1.5 or up to 2 degrees. because most big countries, US, China, India, uh, wanted 2 degrees because they feel like limiting increases to 2 degrees, which means that you have to limit your gases, but only to the extent that you still allow an increase of another 1 degree from that 1 degree, is doable. 1.5 is just requires drastic cuts by everyone in terms of emissions, and that would be too difficult. So that's actually the debate going to Paris. And in fact, the Vatican actually, at that time, also took the position of 2 degrees because that was the more conventional position. But the vulnerable countries, the climate vulnerable countries, that includes the Philippines, that includes actually many of your countries, Bangladesh, many of the island states of the region, we wanted 1.5 degrees because that is safer. The world warming by 1.5 degrees. We will still face what we're facing now, but not as much as we would face if 2 degrees. So it matters. 2 degrees in relation to 2.5 degrees matters. 2.5 degrees in relation to 3 degrees matters. That's why the work for mitigation will never end. Even if you're at 4 degrees, you don't want it to get to 5 degrees. Because, the way I always phrase it is in terms of just the heat. If your temperature is already, for us, because we're near the equator, if your temperature now is already 38 to 40, a 1.5 increase will lead us to what? 42, 43. But at 3 degrees will lead us to 46 or 47. At 5 degrees will lead us to 50, 55. Because it's always double for us. The increase of the temperature is double for our countries. This is a global average. But for us, it's bigger because we're near the equator. So this has been this was the debate. And we lost that in Paris. In Paris, the agreement was 2 degrees. But there was an agreement in Paris but we want to see what 1.5 degrees mean. What does it mean for our countries? Is it doable to do that? So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, did a study on 1.5 degrees and came out with it a year and a half ago. And it's a very disturbing study, and this is where the time frame now comes next. If you agree that what we need is 1.5 degrees, next please. These are impacts. Just a minute before we go to this. If you agree that 1.5 degrees is what we need, then the time frame for change to achieve 1.5 degrees is actually going to be only in the next 10 years. No? Let me just show some videos of some of those impacts that we're talking about. Does it show? Yeah, just I think you just push and it should show. I know it's not showing. There's a video, I think. It's okay. Just show the next one. So we have the 1.5 degree report looked at the specific laws, look at extreme weather. Next. Looked also at loss of water, including on the certification. Sea level rise, that's the Philippines, and how it could impact. Actually, we lose a lot of our cities in Metro Manila. It's that report which led this young lady, Miss Greta Grunberg, to actually start with wonder why it's not playing, but it's okay. To do, you must have heard her speak. It doesn't play now. No, it doesn't play. It's okay. But Miss Sternberg, I remember Miss Sternberg, the first time she spoke in 2018, very different from what she was now. She was just saying, the reason she was invited in Watowice, the conference of the parties of the Climate Change Convention in 2018, was that she had started a strike in Sweden. by herself, only by herself, in 2018. That was a little bit less than a year ago. Imagine that, just by herself. But then, because she framed it around what I call the existential issue of what this means for the future, she's been able to generate a lot of support and a lot of action, especially by young people, where now climate strikes have become a very big thing. It's going to become bigger in the future. It's one of the things that the church and seminaries, because they deal with youth also there, and students would have to deal with in the future. Ironically, 20 years ago in 1992, another young girl actually captured the imagination of the world. And then that's why this is a word of warning also. We might like Greta Thunberg now, but the real test is whether she's listened to and whether decisions are actually made that would change the situation. This girl, Miss Severn Suzuki, she's probably now in her mid-30s, and I wonder what she thinks about all of this. Gave a very powerful speech in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Framing it again the right way is that this is an intergenerational issue. If you don't know how to fix it, please stop breaking it. We are your own children. You're deciding what kind of world we're growing up in. I mean, if you saw Greta Thunberg in the UN, she just went straight after the leaders. And she's not a hypocrite. She calls her own government hypocrites because her own, I mean, the Swedish and the Danish and the Scandinavians like to see themselves as very, very progressive, and they are. I mean, from an objective point of view, but also they do have a lot of contradictions, and I think children are able to tell that, to tell truth, to speak truth to powers directly, and Ms. Suzuki also did that for us in 1992. This is a Filipino survivor of Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, and here she frames climate change as a human rights issue, as a human issue, rather than a scientific issue, an ecosystem issue, an atmosphere issue, and that's important. I think our failure, when I reflect on the work I have done here, which is 30 years of work, lots of sleepless nights, lots of work with scientists, with politicians, with colleagues all over the world, the honest work that we did to try to stop from arriving where we are. And I think the main problem in the work that we did is we were doing this from a bin counting point of view, from an emissions inventory point of view, from a technocratic point of view, rather than from a human point of view. And Ms. Ubaldo here is able to frame it properly as a human development problem, as a climate justice problem. Next. So, next please. I think, yeah. I'll go after this last slide on the cry of the poor. I'll go to the politics. In all of this, it is the poor that is at the front lines. Poor countries and poorest people in all countries. Climate change affects everyone, but it affects the poor disproportionately. And that's the irony of it all, because the poor contributed the least and contributes the least to the problem. Contributes the least emissions, poorest countries contribute the least emissions, poorest peoples, poorest communities contribute the least emissions. But they suffer first and they suffer the most. And that's why, if you having read Laudato Si, you would know that Laudato Si is as much a social justice encyclical as an environmental encyclical. And you have to look at the issue of intergenerational equity, also from that point of view, from a justice point of view. That's again a quotation from Laudato Si, because the poor, the young, the generations that are not yet born even are literally poor. They have no say. They're marginalized, completely marginalized on the kind of world they will live in. So this is the framing that we think, I think, and many of us think that the church should approach climate change as a justice issue, as an equity issue. Next. It has not been like that. And it's only in these last 5 to 10 years that it's begun to change. And I think the church has a lot to do to make that change even more mainstream. In the 1990s, when I was starting on this issue, all that we wanted, those of us who were working in this issue, or most of us, not maybe all, there were some that were visionary. I have to know that that was not enough. But I will not claim to be that visionary. All we wanted was the mitigation of developed countries of their emissions. And that would be enough, we said. If only the United States, the Europeans, Japan, if only they reduced their emissions to levels we were talking about then, like 30% of their current levels, or they go back to 1990 levels, the world will be fine. But that unfortunately assumed that there will be no other changes in the world, that there will be no China, and there will be no India that needs to develop, right? But we should have known India and China has to develop. They have to, and we cannot stop them, and we should not stop them from developing, or Brazil, or the Philippines, or all of our countries. We also have to develop. At some point, it became clear that we are faced with climate change, regardless. By year 2000, so this is 1990 to 2000 mitigation. By year 2000, we realized that whatever we did, adaptation had to be done. And especially for us in developing countries, in all our countries, that became our priority. We have to invest in adaptation rather than mitigation. And I think that was at first a good decision, but we didn't realize that, and we won't realize until you actually try to adapt, that no matter how you adapt, if the problem becomes bigger, the problem becomes more extreme, you can never adapt enough, right? Like, it's like building. One way to adapt to climate change, you might think, is just build a wall, right? I mean, build a dike, though the water will not come in. But you know what that means, right? I mean, you know that at some point, whatever you do, the water will always overwhelm the dike. So then we go back to adaptation, mitigation by all. Now, everyone has to mitigate because the problem has become so big already that even if the developed countries stop emissions or took drastic cuts in emissions, it will actually not change much. You know, a country like the Philippines has less than 1% of emissions in the world. I think all our countries here, except, I don't know if there's an Indonesia. Indonesia would probably be the only country here that has more than 1 degree. Thailand, 1%. Thailand has only 0.52, higher than the Philippines. Indonesia because of its forest, not because of its industry. Indonesia because of it's the second biggest forest in the world, and they're deforesting it, contributes significantly to climate change, almost like a few points. But even if you take, even the Philippines is only 0.4% of the world, 0.4%, not 1%, but 0.4, not 1.0, but 0.4%. The Philippines is still the number 35 country in the world in terms of absolute emissions on an annual basis. The highest now is China, overtaking the US sometime in 2009. The US is still second. And then you have various European countries in the third, fourth, fifth place. Among the developing countries, of course, India would be high. Not very high, but would be high. Brazil would be high. South Africa would be single digits. But not very. So in other words, it's not spread out all over the world. The emissions are spread out already in the world that everyone needs to mitigate. And that's the framework of Paris. Mitigation by all, but for adaptation and mitigation, developing countries must be supported by developed countries under the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is that rich countries were the first to cause this problem, contribute more to the problem, and has more resources. Therefore, they have to support developing countries. That's a justice issue. And I say that also applies internally. Within our countries, it should be the rich that should bear more of the burden of climate change and supporting the poor in terms of helping the poor mitigate their own emissions as well as adapt to climate change. That's not just true as a geographical sort of as a inter-country thing, but within countries, that same principle of equity, of justice actually applies, and we should follow that. And I think the church is positioned to advocate that kind of just approach. Part of a just approach, of a climate justice approach, is what's called a just transition phase. When you try to change your economy, when you try to adapt to climate change, imagine the cities that I said are endangered by climate change. If Mumbai knows that in 40 to 50 years, most of its areas will be submerged. If Bangkok knows that, if Jakarta knows that actually already, and Jokowi has said, taking the political will, we're gonna move to another island, the capital of Indonesia. By the way, just to be accurate, in many of these cities, it's not just climate change that is the problem, right? Overpopulation, it's the subsidence, the use of water that's sinking the place. So it's a combination of all of those. But climate change exacerbated all of these problems. But in all of these cities, if you have to move people around, right? The ones that will be worst affected will be the poor because they have no rights, they have no legal rights to where they are. They have no options of where to transfer, where to move. So part of just transition is to make sure that these things are done right with these populations. The same with workers, farmers, indigenous peoples, women. They're the ones that are most affected by climate change, and a just transition requires that special help is given to them for mitigation and adaptation. And that's what climate justice is all about. It's about a just international system, but also just domestic and community level systems. We've had a long history of negotiations. I won't go through all of that. That's not that interesting to you. But we ended up with the Paris Agreement, which I think is still the best agreement possible at this time. It's not adequate, but the good thing about the Paris Agreement is actually you can change it over time without having to do a negotiation again over a new agreement. So ideally, in 2015, we were able to reach the stage of a good agreement next. That not perfect, but maximum possible time. It's not a carbon agreement, but a sustainable development agreement. Both 2 and 1.5 goals are adopted there. 2 goals adopted, 1.5 goal is made aspirational. It's based on a system of national contributions. National countries set their own targets. Nobody's forcing you to reduce to a number you don't want to reduce. So every country set their own, and now we see it's not adequate. There's some support, but limited only for finance and technology transfer of developing countries. But very important, we created a loss and damage mechanism in that agreement that will allow developing countries to have recourse to something that can help them if climate change causes loss means death, and damage means damage to property. That's us in the plenary hall, very happy when we were finally agreed on the Paris Agreement. Next. This is what I was saying, that we have a loss and damage mechanism which was partly adopted already in Warsaw in 2013. As a result of Haiyan, Yolanda in the Philippines, we were able to get that concession. We call it the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. But we were able to get a separate article on it in the Paris agreement, and include a reference to resilience of communities, livelihoods, and ecosystems to be supported by this mechanism. I'm hopeful for that loss and damage mechanism. It's like your seed for compensation, your seed to internationally to be able to get rich countries to pay for loss and damage resulting from climate change. But it's still initial work. So theoretically, when we were in Paris, in fact, I actually thought, as always, I could retire finally from climate change. My main mission is teaching. I love to teach all sorts of subjects, from philosophy to law and to governance and politics. And this work is very intense. So we thought that this would be enough. The world will have a framework for the next 10 years to deal with the problem of climate change. Well, spoke too soon, because right after the Paris Agreement, literally the next year, 2016, Donald Trump was elected. He was elected. We were actually, the Climate Change Convention was actually meeting in Marrakesh, Morocco. It was the first week of the meeting when Trump was elected, and everyone was shocked because nobody thought that was going to happen. And now we're faced with the most powerful country, or second most powerful. It depends if you think China is more powerful now than the US. Certainly one of the two most powerful countries in the world, most rich country, richest country in the world, one of the biggest, number 2 emitter next to China in the world, that just denies that there is a problem. I mean, this is what Trump really thinks about climate change, that it is created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. So they have left the Paris Agreement officially. Yesterday they filed the paperwork. The reason why it took them 4 years, almost 4 years to do that, was because Paris Agreement was negotiated by Obama, and Obama the agreement was, if you withdraw, you have to withdraw only after 4 years. So that allows an election cycle. So if they withdraw this year but Trump loses next year, the U.S. will likely come back again to the Paris Agreement. That's the reasoning behind that. But you have that. I mean, and you have now the most powerful or the richest country in the world not engaged, and therefore a huge gap in the emissions reductions that have been done. Already we are not the targets in the Paris Agreement, from analysis that I have seen at that time, said that we are still on track for a 3 degrees world. Definitely not a 2 degrees world. But without the US in, and maybe Brazil will join, I hope not, because Brazil's president also thinks that way. Probably he's under more pressure easier to pressure him, or more vulnerable to pressure from partners than the US. That would be another huge gap, because the Amazon is a very big driver also of carbon emissions. So politically, we are actually in a very challenging moment for climate change. We are meeting in Madrid in a few weeks. I don't know what we'll be able to achieve, especially because probably a lot of countries will not be able to go. It's so expensive, much more expensive, and the planning was to go over to Chile. The fare plane trips to Chile are obviously more expensive for most of us, but the hotels in Madrid, I suppose, are going to be much more expensive than it were in Chile. Um, but Glasgow 2020, which is 5 years after Paris, is important because we're going to do a global stock take. We're going to try to see how much have we achieved since Paris, what are the targets that are improved targets, whether they're enough to deal with climate change, with the problem with climate change. With the time frame I told you that we have 10 years from 2018, or 12 years actually from 2018 to try to solve the problem. Otherwise, we're going to be committed to the biggest impacts that I already talked about. Next. Um, what is required for climate change is system change. No? It's the global economy. It's the national economy. It's the way we do our energy system. And this is not rocket science. We know all of that. But it doesn't mean that as institutions and as individuals, there's nothing we can do. I think it's very important to also put this down at the institution level. So a few suggestions, right, is to also look at your own institutional and personal and family lifestyle, carbon lifestyle. I mean, everything from food choices to commuting choices. No? Next. For example, this is an example of days that I mean, meat-free meals. For those, of course, who come from vegetarian cultures, that's a problem. You can of course substitute with other ways of reducing carbon emissions. But meat is a very big driver in the world for both emissions, methane, and also of carbon deforestation because of Brazil, for example. A lot of the meat in the world comes from Brazil, and it comes from the Amazon, from deforesting the Amazon. Next. Water, call it short Tuesdays, shorter waters, reduced minutes that you are taking showers that are important because using of water also includes the use of carbon. Next. Energy, of course, turning your temperature down if you use aircon. You can also save money. That way, of course, those of us who are able to can have recourse. I mean, I wish all the seminaries and all the church-built churches would go solar. Rooftop solar is the thing, and it's really doable in many places now. Again, that's diet also. We call it seasonable Thursdays. Next. And then fuel-free Fridays. Transportation is the biggest driver of one of the biggest drivers of carbon. So there's things we can do, but these things do not add up unless there's system change. These things do not add up. Do not blame yourself. In other words, when we are faced with huge, it's still the big things that have to be done. No more coal power plants. Ban palm oil plantations. I mean, those are the things that really would matter. I mean, so that's why a prophetic voice is very important for the church for that. No? Just to end, I often, people ask me, you've been doing this for 30 years. How long? As I said, I was about to retire after Paris, and then this thing happened with Trump, and then all this new scientific information, and more is coming. The reason why we have a lot of scientific information is coming is because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is coming out with another full report, assessment report, and so a lot of science is being done. I mean, so more things are coming, and they're very challenging things, and the most challenging of which is the time frame is shorter. It's now, in terms of action, we have 10 years. Uh, in terms of impacts, avoiding the worst impacts, we have 30 to 40 years. Otherwise, it will be, as I said, a very different world. But I quote when I quote Martin Luther King for this question of how long. No, how long do you have to keep on going? How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you'll reap what you sow. How long? Not long. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold is always the future, sways the future, and behind the dim unknown stands God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. In other words, this is very important for seminaries because climate change is an ethical issue. It's not a social issue only, it's not a political issue. By all means, it is not a technical and scientific issue, it's an ethical issue. And it matters. It matters when you frame it that way. That's why my next slide is Pope Francis. Because I was in Paris when we negotiated. These I have a couple of pictures to show of that. And I negotiated particularly the provisions on human rights that tried to humanize the problem. And it was amazing to me to hear hardcore, die-hard diplomats and politicians and ministers quoting Pope Francis, quoting Laudato Si, or quoting statements of Pope Francis. First time I've heard in a political context the moral power of the church. I mean, of a church leader being quoted extensively. Once in a while, you always hear the Dalai Lama being quoted because he's very quotable about these things. But Pope Francis was always, again and again and again and again, quoted in the 2 weeks that we were negotiating the Paris Agreement. And I would say that part of why we got there in the first place, why we ended up with a fairly acceptable agreement, was because of that moral force. Because these things are tough. This is a picture of us in Durban in 2011 when we were trying to decide whether to even negotiate a Paris Agreement after we have failed few times already. You see, we've been trying for decades to try to fix the problem from a global point of view because it cannot be fixed without a global effort, for sure, because it's a global problem. The atmosphere is a shared common. It's not appropriated by anyone. No single country can take care of it. So I remember this is 10,000 people in the room and another 200 people around the final decision makers. In this case, trying to decide whether we should negotiate a Paris Agreement or not. That's the African minister that is of foreign affairs that is in the middle of that, and she was able to get an agreement that said, okay, but this time we'll take time. We'll do 4 years to negotiate an agreement, and we did that from 2011 to 2015. Next. Same thing happens in 2013 in Warsaw. Warsaw was very painful for the Philippines because that was what we went to the conference of the parties literally the day after Haiyan hit the Philippines, with thousands of people dead in Leyte, in Tacloban. I flew not knowing that. When I landed all over Europe, in Schiphol, in Amsterdam, all I could see was the Philippines in every screen. And for like the whole news cycle, no other news for 2 to 3 days in Europe while we were there. And here again, you have thousands of people, officials, trying to decide what to do. So it's complicated. I mean, it's complicated to try to get an agreement, and I would always say that we're able to do it finally because of grace. I mean, you have to have grace to be able to talk to each other. And I mean, coming from different cultures, different interests. Next, and I can give you example. This is us in Paris. I was facilitating an agreement on human rights and climate, and successfully did that. These are people from all cultures, quite a lot of Middle Eastern people there with me, negotiating with me, Africans, Europeans. Of course, and here I heard Pope Francis quoted not only by Catholics but also by other people, other cultures. No? That's earlier actually we're trying to negotiate a forest agreement. But you need grace to be able to talk to each other, and I think you will only also be able. I mean, I think the grace requires a certain prophetic voice that comes in also, that reminds everyone this is not a political thing, a technical thing. This is an ethical thing because it involves human beings and the future of human beings and the future also a life of future generations. Then that way you can have a multitude of people. That's Al Gore when he went to the Philippines and trained thousands of us, mostly young people, to advocate on climate change. Next. So I'm 60 years old, happily 60, but I'm still fighting, and I still will probably have to do this until um, we have to do what we have to do. But we find sources for the work that has to be done here, as I'm sure the church will find its own sources, and you will find your own resources rather for strength. Um, I said I was in the Middle East. I was in Israel and spent a lot of time in Galilee actually, and Jordan and the Jordan River. That's Christ in walking. No, that's I think that's the appearance when he um, told them to go back and go back again to the sea and see if they could catch things. I mean, I think that's what we need to have in the future. We have to have that um, unquenchable source of grace and strength, because it will be a very challenging time. And for me, the link to seminarians is what I said earlier. Uh, you have to train priests and church leaders to be prophetic, uh, to speak truth to power, uh, to lead us, including also, of course, lay people probably are even more called to lead us on the political aspects here. You cannot escape from that because there are political issues that have been resolved. That's probably more important in the next 10 years than later. But it will never end, because even if we fail to stop the worst in the next 10 years, it will become even worse if we stop doing anything at all. So I think the prophetic part is there. Uh, but for adaptation, the best form of adaptation uh, is to have a more charitable and more compassionate society. And I would certainly think that the church is best prepared to model the way for institutions to be charitable and compassionate, and for human beings to be charitable and compassionate to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tony. Uh, so we will now engage ourselves into an open forum, no, for those who wish to interact with questions, no, or reflections or insights based on the presentation. Please feel free to do so. So who would want to start? Okay, please introduce. Father.
I'm Luke Rodriguez from Mumbai. Uh, so you said the COP in Glasgow is going to be a very crucial one. So could you just repeat what is the agenda for that? It's evaluating Paris, so what is it? And the other was on this palm oil. You said palm oil plantation. So is there any movement towards stopping that? That was my question.
For Glasgow, it will be a call for more ambition, because I think you can already say that that the commitments in the Paris Agreement are not sufficient, with or without the U.S., by the way. With or without the U.S., that's almost a conclusion. That's why you have to push. Everyone will have to be pushed to have higher commitments, if we're to meet even the 2 degrees. So Glasgow will be about that. But because Glasgow is going to happen right after, or maybe during the U.S. elections, that also is something people will look at. An international community that works on climate change without the U.S. as a country will be very challenging. It can be done because lots of U.S. local governments are doing things anyway in the States, etc. But it's just going to be very different the way we'll approach. So if in fact Trump gets reelected in next year, from a climate change point of view, there'll have to be a lot of rethinking on how to reallocate burdens. And I hope that it does. So far, the U.S. backtracking on Paris has not influenced any other country. I mean, Brazil has been saying it, but that's not because of the U.S. That's because they also elected a president, Bolsonaro. But that's not because of the U.S. But in other words, nobody followed the U.S. and saying, China, for example, instead of, in fact, the good thing about the U.S. withdrawal from Paris, for sure, one good thing about it is China stepped up. Before, China would always say, we are a poor country, we are a weak country, we follow the leader, which is the United States, and developed countries. They always use the past as the excuse for not acting or not acting enough. No? I mean, I know the strategy of China, which was to delay that as much as possible. But by the mid-2000, 2005, 2006, clearly, I mean, I would never treat China anymore like the Philippines or even like India. I mean, India, we know, is still faced with very serious development issues. China's development issues, but they're not poverty issues anymore the way India still has to face. So I would say India is still like the Philippines, a developing country, but a much bigger ones with lots of resources. But China is equivalent, I mean, to a big developed country already. I would say I've been to China many times. I've worked on Chinese issues a lot, and it's just very different already. But now China is the undisputed leader in the climate politics. I mean, and that's a good thing because for years the U.S. in the years that the U.S. was part of the process, they keep on trying to get China to be the co-leader. The U.S. under the Democrats always agreed that they had to be on top of this, the leader. Although we didn't think it was sufficient what they're doing, but at least there was no debate that the U.S. Had to take the lead. But the U.S. was always saying, but China has to take the lead with us. And in the 90s, that was actually not fair because China was not yet there in the 90s. But by mid-2000, I think it was fair that the U.S. was saying, no, China, you should be a co-leader with us. And now China is like the undisputed leader. This latest information on the impacts of cities, so I don't know how that will have an impact on the politics in India, for example, seeing what's being said about some of the cities of India. So that's something I will have to see whether, India's always been, they know they're affected by climate change, so take very strong positions, but also are very protective about their ability to make development decisions, and understandably as well. So I wouldn't say China is a radical, India is a radical on climate change, because they would like to have some what they call some space, some development space to make decisions. But with the new information, new data that we're seeing on the impacts, maybe that will change. The Philippines has long changed because of at least in terms of what they say, not as of what we do. There's a very big disconnect in the Philippines with that. Palm oil is a challenge because it's in Indonesia. and Indonesia's politics of palm oil is a you know is a problem. I mean, they're under pressure even from their neighbors in Singapore, Malaysia, because of the haze problem. But it's also just a lot of money for them. So I would I thought that there was progress made in the first term of President Jokowi, but in the second term, the signals are not very good also on that. But they'll be under pressure because of the situation in the Amazon with Bolsonaro. Actually, the lesson from what's happening in Brazil and Indonesia is it was foolish. You see, in the world, we always thought when you talked about forests in the world, not individually, not individual, but forests in the world. They will always tell you, oh, the only forests that matter globally are Amazon, Indonesia, and the Congo. Just the three big forests. But all three are burning now. So I keep telling that's why all the forests matter, even in the smaller countries. Because if you invest only on those big countries, once the politics change, you can lead to a lot of destruction of forest.
Question. There, the lady. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir, for the very even though that is a policy made in Paris, because we live in a very, very, very unequal world, not just in terms of this great countries to, the richest to the poorest, but even within a country, it is so unequal. So can we nuance that, no, in policy making? A second thing is a minor observation, but I felt you said you would like to call this a black issue. I have the whole climate
issue,
problem a black issue. I was wondering if there is a black African sitting here would feel offended, I'm afraid. Okay, because some years ago, the Time magazine, I think it was in the 1980s, put a cover page on evil with black. And there was a big uprising because a whole nation called themselves black people. Language is small, but language shapes our thinking.
No, that's
so
important.
That could be.
Thank you for international audience. I have to be careful about that. That's in the context of in the Philippines we categorize
understand.
issues as green,
right.
brown,
Sure.
and blue, and therefore I tell people that there are some issues that are really not this, but they're black in the sense of that. But that's well taken. The first one is you're exactly right. On a macro level, that's why I keep on saying you have to frame this as a justice and equity issue, and not only between countries, but within countries. But that's also why that's also why it has to be mitigated by all. Actually, all there doesn't refer by all person. That refer to all countries. Because even in a poor country, there are very rich people in this country that needs to mitigate. That's really my point.
Okay. Any other? Bishop Bala?
Thank you very much, Professor Antonio, for your very comprehensive and systematic presentation, bringing the current situation. I am really enlightened by what's happening. Earlier, I was not thinking it's an emergency matter. Now, it's so clear for me. I would like to know, among all these nations, any country is openly against or indifferent towards climate change to reduce pollution? And what is the reason for the USA to withdraw? Is it political or?
No, it's self-interest. There are economic interests, especially oil and coal, that are extraordinary influential with the Republican Party. And in the past, at least in like the previous Bush administrations, before Trump, the other Republican presidents were the two Bushes, at least there was a counter to them. They already were influential there, oil and coal, but there was a counter. There were scientists, there were moderate Republicans, but now we don't have that. I mean, so that's essentially what it is. I mean, we're discovering now that the oil companies and the coal companies knew about this problem. It's like tobacco. They knew the problem of smoking long before the health problems caused by smoking, long before we were told that it was harmful to our health. Those companies knew it. Long before the scientists were able to accumulate enough numbers to tell us that something wrong was happening in the world, the oil and coal companies knew. But it's the problem. Our problem with here is that the resource that we're talking about, oil and coal, fossil fuel, essentially, it's an asset that they want to be used. And if they don't use it now, they might not be able to use it forever. And our goal is not for them to use it. So their goal is to use it as fast as possible. And our goal is not to use it to keep it on the ground. And that has a lot of money, behind that. So we'll have to see what. And the thing, of course, that elections are not decided on the basis of single issues. So, I mean, there's other reasons why people would vote for Trump and not, let's say, for whoever
Is US also affected by this?
Yes,
pollution or
Florida, New York, all their coastal cities will have also significant effects. I mean, Florida, where Trump is going to live now, he said he's transferred from New York to Florida, will be seriously affected by climate change. I mean, the one country or region they always say might benefit a little bit would be Russia and the stands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, because with the cold and the snow, so much of their land cannot even be used, right? And that might open up. But they'll also have serious problems on heat waves. I mean, ecosystem changes. So I don't think necessarily they will benefit from that. I mean, and they'll have extreme events, because extreme events, weather events, will not choose the country that it will be inflicted on. So no, it's not about whether they be affected or not. It's about a certain group of people or sector or companies that rely on inaction for their business model. From a point of view of economic cost to changing the global economy, it's been said again and again. The war in Iraq, or a war in Syria, or saving the banking system of the United States when it was collapsing in the mid-2000s is far more expensive than changing globally everyone's energy system, because the technology is already there, and the price is already not that as bad as it was 10 years, 20 years ago. So it can be done, but it's a challenge to get the political system to do it. That's why a prophetic voice is very important.
I have a question personally for you, because you presented there that it's like 3 decades you have been working. 30 years, no?
1990.
So the passion is there, clearly. But since 1990, when you have been working, my question is, do you see like a marked significance in something positive for the past 3 decades.
For
We-
sure.
yeah.
For sure. For example, you. The faith communities were there from the very beginning with very small numbers until maybe I would say 2009, Copenhagen, when you started to be more present. So that's a big thing. I mean, because then the human dimension, I said the failure. My view is the failure in our part was we tended to make this technical, technocratic, scientific, rather than ethical, and rather than human. Okay, so that's a big thing. But even technologies wise, I mean, if you go to all of these meetings, it happens every year, twice a year, in fact. You will see a lot of human creativity being put into trying to solve the problem, as well as trying to adapt to the problem. And so, that's why I'm not I'm actually, when I say it's a existential issue, I actually don't really mean end of the world, and I actually don't mean the kind of world that you see in movies, like dystopian movies where nobody can eat anymore and everyone's killing each other. I don't think it's gonna be that. It's just gonna be difficult. It's gonna, we're already facing some of that. Like right now we have in Mindanao a big earthquake. It's gonna be like that more regularly. That's what it is. Or you're gonna have more typhoons and more. It's gonna be you just have to be more. I mean, in India they have sometimes moved millions of people in less than a couple of days. They just have to do that more and more often. So it's not going to be the end of the world. I mean, although who knows, right? But it's not going to be like, it will just be a much more difficult world. But because of that, we already developing. There's lots of things we already can use to adapt. Even the way we design our houses, the way when you build your seminaries, by the way, it's a very important thing. You must always have a climate assessment for your seminaries, no? In terms of energy and in terms of safety. Our churches. I mean, a priest just got killed in New York, of all places, because of a flash flood. So those things are not rocket science, and we've made a lot of progress there in that. But again, as I said, it's just I actually read that particular thing and about that. Eventually the most important adaptation mechanism is more compassion, more charity, ability to give, ability to that's really that's what you need. So I see all of this. I mean, in the last 30 years, and it's clearly not enough. I mean, but I'm not also ready to say that we have been defeated. I mean, I don't think we have been. I don't think we have been defeated. It looks like we are being defeated now because of the political situation. But politics change in a moment in the world, in any country and in the world, and so I actually don't lose sleep over politics and over politicians. I mean, they themselves can change, and they can also just leave anytime without warning. So I just don't lose sleep over that. My view, Bishop, is for future generations, right? That this is that we do this for future generations. We equip, and that for sure is a progress too. The kids today, those in their teens or early 20s, they know this issue much more than my generation would know, or many of our generation would know, and that's a good thing. That means they're equipped for it better than us.
Thank you. So it's almost 4 o'clock, no? So we once again thank Professor Tony Lavinia. Please give him a warm applause for this very enlightening afternoon. No, I'm sure we learned a lot. No, and it's not only